Konnichiwa, I'm John Hornick. Welcome to my Japanese Faves series where we'll cover every major type of Japanese food. This lesson is cooking with sake. Now I also have a 104 lesson cooking course called Learning to Cook Like a Pro, One Small Plate at a Time. It starts off easy, gets progressively more difficult, and then it ends with the ultimate challenge, which is actually 5 lessons in one. You can also watch my other series such as Italian Faves, Impress Your Date, Sauces to Die For, Spain on a Small Plate, French Faves, and also bonus lessons, which are things like breaking down a chicken or making stock. Now in this lesson we're going to talk about what sake can do. Now, if you're thinking about sake kind of from the Western perspective of cooking, you can use it exactly like you'd use white wine. White wine's often used to deglaze a pan, it's used as an ingredient in sauces or in a dish, and it's also used in marinades. And you can use sake exactly the same way. But again, that's kind of the Western view of cooking. We're going to talk about some uses of sake that are more uniquely Japanese. Now, one of the things that sake can do is to be used in a marinade. Now, marinades have two basic purposes. One is to tenderize. That's actually the primary purpose of a marinade. And the secondary benefit of marinades is to add flavor. Now, marinades usually have, they always have acids in them, such as something like lemon juice or lime juice or vinegar. And they also sometimes also have alcohol. Right now, the acids and the alcohol, they tenderize proteins, such as beef or pork or chicken. Now, sake has both. It has both acid and it has alcohol. Now, the acids that are in sake are lactic acid and succinic acid. And these acids actually make sake much easier to pair with food than white wine. I have a separate video in on my YouTube channel in my Japanese Faves series called Ordering Sake in a Restaurant. Now, in addition to tenderizing, sake also has flavor, okay? So it's adding flavor to the food as it's marinating. And you may have, if you have limited exposure to sake, you may think of it as being kind of one-dimensional. But there are a lot of sakes out there, and there's a lot of range in their taste. And the taste can be from subtle to rich, all right? Now, when you make a marinade, you're usually mixing the sake with other ingredients. You could use just sake as a marinade, but usually you're mixing it with other ingredients. And together, the sake and those other ingredients, they tenderize the protein and they also add flavor. Now, another thing that sake can do is to accentuate flavor, right? Now, marinades accentuate flavor, but sake can accentuate flavor without it being in a marinade. In other words, you can just use it alone. It will accentuate flavor on its own. I think sake is kind of like a magic ingredient. It has kind of a magic quality of brightening flavors. Now, another thing that sake can do is add flavor. Now, one of the flavors that it can add is the flavor of the sake itself, all right? The flavor that it adds, there are basic flavors. They're salty, sweet, sour, and bitter, all right? And umami is often called the fifth flavor. Umami is variously translated as as savory or tasty. I translate the word umami as yummy, yumminess, all right? And so sake has umami, it has yumminess, all right? It can also enable something called kokumi. Kokumi is actually, the way I view it, it's the experience of taste. It's the experience of richness and body and texture and complexity. It's the experience of those things. It doesn't add those things. It's the experience of those things. I have separate Japanese fave lessons on what is umami and also another one called kokumi, the sixth flavor, question mark. And I say question mark because I don't think it really is the sixth flavor. Some people have called it that. I don't think it is. Anyway, watch those two videos. You'll learn all about umami and kokumi. Now, what else can sake do? Sake can balance or moderate flavor. It can neutralize aromas such as fishiness. Right? It can speed cooking, and it can make fried foods crunchier. Also, according to the umami, I'm not a big baker. Okay, most of my lessons are, in fact, almost all of my lessons are savory. They're not sweet. Um, but I did find a couple of recipes that I'll talk about later where sake is used in sweet baked goods, right? And according to the Umami Insider, which is a website and a web store, sake also helps to keep baked goods moist. And another thing that sake can do is it can be used to preserve, and I'm going to give you a couple of good examples of that later on in this lesson. Now, what sake should you use when you're using it to cook? Well, it doesn't need to be expensive. It doesn't need to be expensive at all. In fact, it shouldn't really be expensive. You should use futsushu, which is actually table sake. If you're using a ginjo or a daiginjo, you're really kind of wasting the quality of those sakes in the dish. It's the refinement of those sakes isn't really going to come through, and you're spending more money than you need to. So just use a table sake. However, don't use anything you wouldn't drink, okay? If you wouldn't drink it on its own, don't use it to cook. Now, don't use, or I'm going to say, don't use cooking sake. I don't use cooking sake. There are sakes out there that are sold as cooking sakes, all right? My understanding is that they are more concentrated. I've never used them. I don't really know much about them. But what I do understand is drinking sake. I understand the sake that I drink, okay? So that's what I use to cook, just like I use white wine that I would drink. Now, if you use dry sake or sweet sake, you're going to get different results. And again, if you don't have a lot of exposure to sake, you may not know the incredible range there is between sweet and dry, okay? So if you use sweeter sake, you're going to get a bit more of a sweet result. If you use drier sake, you're going to get more of a dry result. Let's talk about clear sake versus nigori. Now, nigori is sometimes called unfiltered sake. That's not what it is. It's partially filtered sake. You know, to be sake legally, made in Japan at least, it has to go through a filtration process. Nigori is partially filtered sake, and it leaves in the sake a white sediment that can make the sake kind of milky, all right? And you're going to get different results whether you use clear sake or nigori sake, and that's your choice, really, and experiment with it. Now, some recipes you might see call for sweet sake. Now, I don't know exactly what they mean. They could mean drinking sake that is higher in residual sugar, but I think what they're usually, and they could mean cooking sake, but what they mean usually is mirin. Okay, now mirin is similar to sake. Process to make it is similar to sake, but it is sweeter and it is more of a condiment, like a sauce, like soy sauce, and they are different. Sake and mirin are different, okay? So if something calls for sweet sake, use mirin, don't use sake. Now, let's talk about marinating. And now we're going to talk about actual use of the sake, okay? Now, in marinating, as I said before, marinades, they tenderize and they add flavor. They can also moderate flavors and neutralize unpleasant odors. And you can use sake alone as a marinade, as I mentioned before, or you can use it with other ingredients. Now, I've given here on the screen a chart. This chart comes from another lesson in my Japanese Faves series called Demystifying Shoyu-based sauces. Okay, shoyu is Japanese soy sauce. And here on the screen I have several different sauces that are used for different purposes in Japanese cooking. Now, these are all sauces, but because they contain acid in the form of the sake, they can also be used as marinades. So any of these sauces in this chart that I describe more fully in my Demystifying Japanese Shoyu-based sauces lesson, any of these can be used for marinating. Okay, now, I have another lesson called Demystifying Japanese dashi-based sauces. Now, dashi is Japanese stock, basically. And one of the uses of dashi is to make a concentrated base called mensuyu. All right, and this mensuyu is used in it's used in broths and it's used in sauces, and it's a concentrated base again. And you're going to dilute it, and when you dilute it, you add other things. And one of the things that you add is sake. So you could use mensuyu also as a marinade. And again, it has the same effects as any other marinade to tenderize, flavorize, neutralize flavors. And again, you can use sake alone or in combination with other ingredients, such as the ingredients in the mensuyu. Now, another use of sake is simmering. All right. Again, it has the same effects. In addition to cooking the food, it tenderizes, it flavorizes, it moderates flavors. Okay. Now, you could simmer food in sake alone. All right. Or you could simmer it in sake that has been mixed with some water. Usually like a 1-to-1 ratio if you're mixing with water. But you could also simmer in something like the mensuyu that I showed you on the prior slide, which is a dashi-based sauce, soup base, or actually a dashi-based concentrated base. All right, and or you could also simmer in any of the shoyu-based sauces that I showed you a couple of slides back. Now that's simmering. All right, now steaming is similar. Okay, instead of cooking the food directly in the liquid, you are cooking it above the liquid, which is giving off steam. And again, you can steaming will accentuate the aroma of the food, and you could steam the food in sake alone or in sake mixed with some water, equal parts water is what I usually do, or you could mix the sake with other ingredients such as dashi or any of the sauces that I showed you in the charts on shoyu-based sauces or dashi-based sauces. And I have one lesson in my Japanese Faves series, as of this date at least, where I am steaming clams in sake steamed clams. Okay. Now, steaming with sake is especially good for use with chicken or with fish or shellfish or virtually any kind of vegetable. Also, you can use it in rice. And usually when you make rice, you use some proportion of water to rice, okay? And depending on what kind of rice it is, you may be using 1-to-1 proportion or you might be using 2-to-1 proportion. And what you can do is you can substitute some of that water for sake. So for example, if it's 2-to-1 ratio of water to rice, you could use half sake and half water. Or you might not want to use that much. You can just use some as a flavor ingredient. Just take out a couple of tablespoons of water, add in a couple of tablespoons of sake. Again, experiment with it. If you use the proportion of half water to half sake in your rice, you may think it's too strong. So you'll have to decide. Or you may really like it that way. All right, another use of sake is to add it to virtually any cooking method. Right now, for example, you can add it in a stir fry. Add a tablespoon or two to a stir fry. Adds flavor, accentuates flavors. Also in grilling, you can sprinkle it on the food that you're grilling, or you can brush it on the food that you're grilling. And an interesting use that I made not too long ago actually, is to if I was making cedar plank salmon, and I brushed the cedar plank generously with sake. Adds extra aroma, and it helps to steam the fish just like if you had a water-soaked cedar plank. And the sake has the effect of brightening and balancing the flavors. Right? Now, you can also use sake as an ingredient in a dish. And one of the best types of dish to use sake in as an ingredient is soups or nabes. Nabes are hot pots. And again, it has the effect of accentuating, brightening, and adding flavor. And as it turns out, I have used sake in almost all of my donabe lessons. And donabe 1 is sweet chicken hot pot. Donabe 2 is chicken and pork belly nabemoto. Donabe 3 is braised beef brisket with shiokoji and vegetables, and Donabe 4, I don't think has any sake in it, but Donabe 5, which is duck and pork belly kitchen sink hot pot, that has sake in it. And my most recent Donabe dish, which is tsukune, which is chicken meatballs and udon noodles, that has sake in it as well. So sake is a great added ingredient to dishes, especially soups and hot pots. As an ingredient, you can use dashi in all of the sauces that I talked about earlier, in the shoyu-based sauces and in the mensuyu-based sauces. It's a standard ingredient in almost all of those sauces. Also, I mentioned earlier that sake can be used in baking, and I found this recipe for sake pound cake by Anita Jacobson. And I haven't made it myself, but it looked really good, and I thought I would include it in this lesson. She has a website called Daily Cooking Guest, and or at least it's on that website. I'm not sure if that's her website or not. Anyway, I found it on that website. I have the link here in case you want to find that recipe. I also found a recipe for sake apple pie. All right, and this was on the website of the Japan Sake and Shochu Makers Association. I give you the link here in case you want to go to it. And that website also has many other savory and sweet dishes made with sake. Now, finally, let's talk about finishing and garnishing. Sake can be used also, I said earlier, it can be used just like you would use white wine. It can also be used like you would use lemon juice. Okay, so just as you might squeeze lemon juice over a piece of grilled fish, you can sprinkle a little bit of sake over the grilled fish as well. So you can use sake, and I put lemon juice on a lot of different things. Even on beef, I'll sprinkle a little bit of lemon juice or squeeze a little lemon juice over a steak sometimes. And I think it's really great. It brightens the flavor. And sake does the same thing. A great example is in a podcast that I listened to called Sake Revolution by Tim Sullivan and John Puma. And Tim Sullivan, who lived in Japan for a while and worked at a sake brewery there, he was telling a story about being at the brewery where they also had a pizza oven, a wood-fired pizza oven. And they made wood-fired pizza one night, and then they sprinkled sake on the wood-fired pizza, and he said it was fantastic. I thought this was a great example of using sake for finishing. And by the way, I highly recommend that podcast, Sake Revolution. Now, sake kazu is something I'm not going to talk about in this lesson. Sake kazu is the lees or the sediment that's left over after you brew sake. And it can be used in cooking, and I will probably do a separate lesson on that at some point. I have one lesson in my Japanese Faves series so far that uses sake kazu, and that is kazu ice cream. There's a photo of it here, kind of blurred behind in the background of this slide. That I think could be a whole lesson in itself, so we're not going to talk about that here. The last thing that I wanted to talk about is preserving, using sake as a preservative. Now, a very good friend of mine who's no longer with us, unfortunately, told me about this idea. She told me about using sherry to preserve garlic and ginger. Okay, you know, when you buy ginger, I don't know about you, but it often shrivels up before you get a chance to use the whole piece that you have, right? But you want to keep it handy. You want to have it there when you want it. So she said, put it in a container with some sherry. Now, I do that, but I also do the same thing with sake. And I use these Talente gelato containers, great gelato, and also really good containers, okay? But don't get them hot, by the way. They're not good for hot. They're good for cold. So what I do is I put some garlic cloves or some pieces of ginger into these containers, and then I cover them with sake. Again, you don't want to use expensive sake for this. Use futsushu. Use table sake. All right, so that's a great use of sake. And you know, I keep I keep ginger and garlic in containers like this with sake for long periods of time. And so, and I always have fresh garlic on hand, but I don't often have fresh ginger on hand. I don't use ginger a lot, but when I need it, I need it, right? So I keep it preserved in the sake or preserved in the sherry. Take some out, use it just like you would fresh. All right, so I hope this video inspires you to cook with sake, gives you some ideas. Experiment, okay? You can just try different things, see how you like them. Use sake to simmer some food without diluting it. See how you like that. Use it in some rice and see how you like that in different proportions. So please remember to subscribe to my channel, and thanks for watching.